Daily Detroit is brought to you by the community. Support our work at patreon.com/dailydetroit.
I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. And this is your Daily Detroit for January 2nd, 2019.
Happy New Year from the Podcast Detroit studios. We made it to season 2.
Yay! There's been a lot going on around Detroit and up in Lansing since we've been on holiday. After our headlines, I'll dive into what survived and what died from an unprecedented lame duck session and what Michigan's new governor, Democrat Gretchen Whitmer, has in mind for 2019. That's with Emily Lawler, a Lansing reporter with MLive. But first, Jer, how's your holiday season?
Good, man, good. This was the first real break I've taken since starting the show, so I stayed close to home, and I tried to do as little as possible.
Good for you.
Saw family, and also totally won at that game Apples to Apples.
I'm totally not familiar with that.
That's the one where you do the card match, where it's you give a definition of a word, you draw the word, and it gives a definition, and then the other players have to come up with something that matches that word.
Sounds like fun, man. You'll have to teach it to me sometime.
Sven, how was it for you?
It was good, man. Indulgent, though. Very indulgent. I'm ready. I feel like I'm ready for like a detox session and just I'm actually kind of looking forward to getting back into the routine and the grind and everything. And then my mother-in-law yesterday drops off a new, container of all of her leftover Christmas cookies, which was definitely not something I needed.
I have a friendly suggestion. I believe that Randy and Cheyenne would sign on this. You should bring them into the studio.
All right. Say no more. The Detroit Police Department says the city's number of murders has fallen to numbers not seen in more than half a century. Detroit Police Chief James Craig tells the Detroit News on Tuesday there were 261 criminal homicides in 2018. That's down 6 from the last year and the lowest number since 1966. But we're going to put an asterisk on this statistic. The city of Detroit had many more residents back in 1966, around 1.5 million. That makes today's per capita rate very high at about 39 per 100,000 residents. Craig acknowledges in the news piece that the department still has work to do. We'll link to the story in the show notes. Although it's a small improvement, many people are skeptical of the city's self-reported numbers around crime due to the city's own track record. In the past, the city's numbers have conflicted with the numbers provided by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For instance, from 2015 to 2016, Detroit police reported a 5% drop in violent crime in the city. The FBI reported an increase of more than 15%. The city rolled out its much-vaunted Crime Information Viewer portal earlier this year. But if you visit it online today, there are obvious problems. When we first visited and set the time parameters for the calendar year 2018, it showed just 14 homicides on the map for the entire year. Then, when we revisited later, it showed only 1 from all of 2018. The site appears to show much more information about stolen cars and other crimes.
So, Sven, here's the deal. We all know Detroit has a crime problem and has an understaffed police department. You interviewed a Washington Post reporter last year on this very podcast about how few detectives they have compared to the caseload to investigate homicides. And of course, we'll link to this in the show notes. But it just goes to show, fully transparent data would help everyone get their arms around this problem.
Right. Make it easier to find. And, we should all be operating from the same set of numbers, frankly.
We don't often wade into U.S. Russia relations on Daily Detroit, but we are today. That's because Russia's Federal Security Service says it has arrested a man from Novi who's being accused of espionage. Russian authorities arrested Paul Whelan December 28th in Moscow, where he had reportedly planned to attend a wedding. Whelan is an ex-Marine who works as Director of Global Security for the auto supplier BorgWarner in Auburn Hills. The Russian government has given no details. If convicted, he could face 20 years in prison. According to reports, the Russian government said it has allowed U.S. consulate officials to visit with him for the first time since his arrest. The State Department is also trying to gain access to him and learn more about the charges he faces, but the department is hobbled by staffing issues related to the ongoing government shutdown. The Marine Corps says Whelan served from 1994 to 2008 when he was convicted of larceny in a special court-martial. He had risen to staff sergeant, had 2 deployments to Iraq, and was given a bad conduct discharge in late 2008 at the rank of private. There's speculation this could be a tit-for-tat retaliation for the conviction of Maria Butina, a Russian civilian who pleaded guilty last month in the U.S. to acting as a foreign agent. Sven, I understand you have a connection to this crazy story.
Yeah, that's right. I was reading about this morning and I started getting growing recognition. Turns out I went to high school in Ann Arbor with Paul Whelan and his twin brother David, who's acting as the family's spokesman now. I should caution, I don't know these guys well at all. I didn't recognize him by the photo. It's been years since I heard anything about them. We played soccer together back in the day, but this was enough to send me to my old high school yearbook. I pulled it out, and sure enough, there they were. Paul Whelan, I mean, for what it's worth, was active in like anti-drunk driving, student group association things, German and French clubs and everything. So his brother David, who was one I played soccer with, in fact, his dad was our coach, is a published author and a library information technology expert who lives in Ontario. He said that his brother has traveled to Russia in the past many times for work and to visit friends that he had made there. He wrote on Twitter yesterday that the family had learned about his arrest only after reading about it in media reports, and that they've been in contact with members of Congress, the U.S. Embassy, State Department, etc. He writes, quote, "We are deeply concerned for his safety and well-being. His innocence is undoubted, and we trust that his rights will be respected, End quote. This is a crazy story, and you know, you often hear about former classmates going on to fame or infamy or whatever, but you never want to read about it, something like this. I mean, being incarcerated in Russia just doesn't sound like a good situation at all.
The city of Detroit is cracking down on 6 types of businesses that are growing quickly in the city. The moratorium will prevent new businesses from opening for 1 year, starting April 1st. The business categories are used tire storage and sales, used auto sales, scrap iron and metal processors, junk dealers, auto dismantling and wrecking, and new major and minor auto repair places. Existing businesses in those categories will have 90 days to come into compliance with the city's regulations or be shut down. The mayor says the goal is to limit how close these businesses are to each other, to force owners to improve property maintenance, decrease crime, and put a stop to what the city is calling, quote, illegal business operations, unquote. Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by Milo Digital. Milo Digital is a full-service digital marketing agency that engineers quality results through data and innovative strategies. Learn more at milodetroit.com.
Since we last recorded a new episode of Daily Detroit, Michigan has a new governor, as Democrat Gretchen Whitmer was sworn into office on Tuesday. Before that happened, former Governor Rick Snyder had to deal with hundreds of bills sent to him during an unprecedented lame duck session. Joining us to go over all that is Emily Lawler. She covers the state capitol for MLive. Emily, thanks for joining us on Daily Detroit. Happy New Year. Absolutely. So, busy end to the year in 2018 with a kind of an unprecedented lame duck session. I'm sure you ended up working a lot more hours than maybe you expected. I read somewhere that there was something like 400 bills sent by the GOP legislature to the governor for his consideration.
Yeah, during that lame duck period, just under 400 bills made it to him. And then, of course, he was pretty crunched on time to get them all signed or vetoed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go through them one at a time. Are you ready? I kid. But in all seriousness, though, there was a lot of really controversial legislation dealing with everything from weakening regulations for the environment and campaign finance regulations to weakening the powers of incoming Democratic Secretary of State and Attorney General. Can you kind of give us a few of the big ticket things that Governor Snyder shot down? In other words, that he vetoed. Where did he use his veto pen?
Yeah, I think that the most significant is one you just mentioned, a bill that some people were concerned would have taken some power away from the Attorney General by giving the legislature the power to intervene in lawsuits. He shut that down and he vetoed it and expressed some concerns about the separation of powers in his veto letter. And that was actually the only one that ended up making it to his desk of that sort of, power undermining variety. The Secretary of State one didn't end up making it through the House. So that was kind of the biggest outstanding thing on his plate that he put his foot down on.
Okay. Any other big ones that he rejected?
Kind of a smattering of interesting ones. There was some kind of specific tax breaks that he was not a fan of. There was one that would have made Michigan's ban on telemedicine abortion a long-term thing. Right now it's sunsetted actually 2 days ago, December 31st. He vetoed that as well. I'm not sure that was a huge surprise. And then also vetoed one on baby boxes that would have let parents surrender newborns through a box. I know that sounds weird, but through a box instead of handing it to a person at a police or fire department.
That's so they could literally put their newborn in a box at the police or fire department?
Yeah, but it was a specially designed box. I think they were technically called newborn safety devices that would, I guess, alert someone that there was a baby in the box.
Weird, but this was vetoed at any rate.
Yeah, and it actually falls into kind of a pattern of right-to-life bills that has found his veto pen throughout his tenure.
Let's pivot then to some of the bills that he did sign into law. What were some of the big ones?
Yeah, I would say start with kind of the environmental ones that you mentioned. There were some that people were pretty concerned about. Some of those got a little changed, maybe watered down before they hit his desk. But probably the biggest one, and one that I know that Governor Whitmer has expressed concerns about, is House Bill 4205. And that's sometimes referred to as the no stricter than federal bill. So basically, making it so that it's harder for Michigan to put in place standards that are higher than the federal government. This has come into play in a couple of issues in Michigan recently, especially as we look to set environmental standards around things like lead and the copper rule and PFAS.
Yeah, PFAS, which I know MLive has written about extensively, because isn't there a big push in Michigan to get stricter regulations than the federal mandates for PFAS?
Yeah, so my colleagues Garrett Ellison and Paula Gardner have really spent, I guess, a year or more delving into this issue. And one of the things that they found is that this kind of lack of federal mandate around PFAS, and then also, from my understanding, the science kind of indicates that the federal guidelines may not be stringent enough either. So that is something that has been talked about, whether we need some sort of Michigan standard that could address that.
Gretchen Whitmer, as you mentioned, she was sworn in yesterday as Michigan's newest governor. I'll ask you more about that in just a moment. But what has she said about some of those new environmental laws that the outgoing governor signed?
I think the gist of it, of her comments and responses to those pieces, especially 4205, is just a concern that it could, tie her hands or hinder her ability to address some of these emerging issues, especially. I mean, a year ago, 2 years ago, who could have told you that PFAS was going to be something we'd be worried about here in Michigan on the scale that we're worried about it today?
Emily, you had a good story published a couple of days ago. The headline is Governor Rick Snyder Leaves Mixed Legacy in Big Michigan Cities. We'll link to it in the show notes. But you talk about how the governor has his legacy is going to be largely defined by what happened in Flint and also in Detroit, the lead water crisis in Flint, and then, of course, kind of shepherding the city of Detroit through its bankruptcy a few years ago. What has the governor said? I know you met with him as part of a roundtable. What has he kind of said about, wrapping up his 8 years in office?
It's interesting, but he's not super pensive or backward looking, which I guess I should have seen coming. We've seen throughout his 8 years as governor that he's always thinking years ahead of everyone else, it seems like. But, he was pretty clear that he didn't really think about legacy, so that left it to me to think about legacy, which is why I came up with this story. But, yeah, I think that, this kind of urban track record he has kind of highlights a really high, shepherding Detroit through this bankruptcy process without having to sell out assets like the DIA. And then also a really low, which is the Flint water crisis.
So as we mentioned before, Governor Whitmer took the oath of office yesterday out in front of the state capitol. I know you were there in the cold weather and everything. What did she have to say, and what are her thoughts about kind of, when she looks ahead to working with a Republican-controlled legislature?
Yeah, it was cold. She joked with the reporters on a conference call before that we should all wear our long underwear, so I regret to say I don't own any. But her speech was very, very bipartisan in tone, and that's something we saw kind of throughout the campaign. I think she was pragmatic about the fact that she would likely be working with at least one, if not two, Republican-controlled chambers. She drew two based on the results of the election. So, she struck this tone of building bridges. She did make one little dig about building bridges, not walls.
Yeah.
But she definitely, she acknowledged the legislative leaders, Democratic and Republican, who were at the event, and then, immediately afterward talked about the need to work together to get things done for Michiganders. So I think she's approaching it in that spirit. Of course, a little bit of that and the efficacy of that message depends too on how willing Republicans are to come to that table. Right.
Did she give any indication as to what her priorities are for the upcoming session?
Right after the election at a press conference, she named clean drinking water as her top priority. Obviously, I think we've got an indication that fixing the, quote, damn roads is definitely on her agenda as well. But really one of the first priorities for any governor taking office is putting together a budget. She's got to present that, I think, in February. And that'll kind of give us an idea of some of her priorities, for not only funding, but where she wants to go policy-wise with some of the things she's trying to prioritize as well. So looking for that budget, looking for specifics on some of the proposals that she's mentioned earlier on roads and clean drinking water. And I think those will kind of start to come out in the next couple weeks and months.
All right. Well, Emily Lawler covers the state capitol for mlive.com. Thanks so much for joining us, Emily.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And since we recorded with Emily, there's been breaking news. Governor Whitmer says she has requested a legal opinion from the new Attorney General, Dana Nessel. She's asking Nessel whether legislation that Snyder signed last month regarding the controversial Enbridge Line 5 pipeline in the Straits of Mackinac is constitutional. Snyder signed legislation that creates a new Mackinac Straits Corridor Authority to oversee the construction of a new tunnel underneath the straits. It would house the aging oil pipeline, a process that's expected to take years. On the campaign trail, Whitmer repeatedly said she would work to shut down Line 5, which transports heavy crude oil and other petroleum products, and has been operating well beyond its expected lifespan.
There were a few other bills Snyder signed. One to make it harder to get proposals on the statewide ballot by requiring that no more than 15% of signatures can come from any one of Michigan's 14 congressional districts. This one makes it much harder for ballot initiatives, like the one that legalized recreational marijuana last year, to succeed. Another will assign A through F letter grades for K-12 schools, a controversial move in the education community. There's a $1.2 billion spending bill for roads, PFAS contamination, Asian carp, and other things, and a limit on when people can legally shoot fireworks from neighborhoods from 30 days to 12, mostly around the 4th of July.
Amen to that one. That's it for Your Daily Detroit. I'm Sven Gustafson, and it's good to be back.
Yes, Sven, it is, and it's good to be back with all of you. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.
You're listening to the Podcast Detroit Network. Visit www.podcastdetroit.com for more information.
So, you man, holidays, how was it? That's terrible. Let's try that again.
That was terrible. So, you man.